Hello, I'm Karan Dhamija, and an intern here at the AIIA National Office and the editor of Australian Outlook. Today we have with us David Coltart, who was a Member of Parliament and Senator in Zimbabwe until 2013. He also wrote the books The Struggle Continues, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe, which was published last year. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Good being with you.
For those of us who live far away from those shores, Zimbabwe floats in and out of the news for us. Would you like to talk a bit about the experiences and the developments of the last 8 to 10 years ever since the deep end of the economic and political crisis there?
Zimbabwe's been on a roller coaster for the last 60 years, never mind 8 years, but the last 8 years have been marked by a stabilization of the country and then its subsequent decline since the election of 2013. Prior to that, there was the inclusive government, which had been brokered by the African Union and SADC, which stabilized the country, resulted in a new constitution being endorsed by an overwhelming majority of Zimbabweans. But sadly, the election which followed that in July 2013 was in breach of the constitution. It resulted in Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF getting an overwhelming majority again, and that in turn has caused a collapse of business confidence and the decline of the country. So sadly, it's back in a state of crisis.
That sounds really interesting, because you also talked about in your book, and you've often said that the analysis of Zimbabwe, without taking into account the effects of the long civil war that lasted for more than a decade, is incomplete. Do you want to talk a bit more about the impact that that's still having on the political landscape?
To speak to an international audience, one has to look, for example, closer to an Australian audience. You've got the impact of Vietnam, and the fact that Vietnam still has an impact on American society, even though that war ended decades ago. American veterans are still affected by post-traumatic stress syndrome. But the difference between Vietnam and Zimbabwe is that whereas in Vietnam the protagonists are now separate, the Americans went home, the Vietnamese were left to govern. In Zimbabwe, the protagonists are still in the country. And we haven't had the medical attention that we should have, veterans on both sides. And unfortunately, to understand the madness of some of the policies of the last 17 years, one has to understand the impact that the war still has in terms of creating levels of bitterness and hatred that are inexplicable unless you take into account the effect of the war.
And how have the ruling ZANU-PF party used those lingering issues in their own political benefit?
This problem was compounded by the fact that, unlike South Africa, we never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we've never closed the door on the atrocities committed by all sides during that war. And unscrupulous politicians like Mugabe use that history to make political points, not just against white people like me, but even against legitimate black opponents. So you'll have a leader like Morgan Tsvangirai, and he is branded not as an opposition person, but as a traitor, as someone who's associated himself with white people, who wants to bring back colonialism. And of course, it's nonsense, but because of that history, it carries some weight.
Wonderful. Lastly, you characterize yourself as an optimist, and you've said that you're very optimistic about the future of Zimbabwe and the region of Southern Africa. What do you see the future being, and what is the stem and the root cause of your optimism?
You have to come to Zimbabwe to understand why I'm optimistic. It is a country that is remarkably blessed. It has wonderful people, very high literacy rates in Africa, a very warm people. It is one of the least, surprisingly, racial societies in the world. It is also blessed with incredible natural resources, a wide range of minerals, everything from platinum to gold to iron ore to diamonds. It is blessed with rich agricultural lands, rivers, fantastic tourist resorts. It is strategically located right in the middle of Southern Africa. it's one problem. The one missing ingredient is democracy. And my view is that the moment we get even just a modicum of democracy, Zimbabwe will boom. It used to be one of Africa's strongest economies. It used to, in British Commonwealth terms, it almost became a dominion. So that is the historical status of the country. It is a country of enormous potential, and will realize that potential once we embrace and root democracy.
Thanks so much for joining us, Senator Coltart.
Thank you.
For more, visit our YouTube channel AIIA Vision and subscribe to our blog Australian Outlook. Thank you so much.